We're live. All right. Welcome, folks, once again to another set of 3 lectures. This time it's the fall lecture series rather than the summer. And we're going to do these one Tuesday a month, so October, November, December. And this first one is going to be on Constantine. The one in November is going to be on Augustine. And the one in December will be on Dante. So we're kind of working our way down chronologically. At some point, I'll want to loop back and pick up some of the people we missed. And fair warning, I'm going to throw another person in tonight because he writes a biography of Constantine, and he's very important for us, an early bishop who was actually at the Council of Nicaea, and we have an eyewitness account because of him. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about Eusebius. But yeah, once again, I'm Rob Shearer. I'm the director, co-director along with my wife Cindy of the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. And it is a ministry and hosted by, and we're very, very grateful to Abundant Life Church. And to Carrie West back in the back, who is our tech person, tech director, and operating all the electronics so that we go out on YouTube and Facebook, and it will be recorded and available for viewing later on. So let me pray before I start. Father, thank you for an opportunity to gather again and to think a little bit about some of the important historical figures who have made an impact and shaped the course of history, who have had an impact on the history of your church, and whose lives still affect us today. Help us to understand and to sift and to see the positive and the good, and also the negative that perhaps should be avoided. I pray you'll bless our time together. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, so this is actually a rather famous statue of Constantine, although I confess I didn't know anything about it and hadn't seen it until about 5 years ago. But that's me down at the bottom with the statue. And that's doing my Michelangelo Sistine Chapel pose with Constantine. But the interesting thing is the location of that statue. And my students never get it. And I couldn't have told you until I bumped into it quite by accident on one of my European trips. It's in York, England. Because that's where Constantine was proclaimed emperor. His father had been the emperor in the West and had been based in Shearer, in northern Gaul, and that included the province of Britain, because ever since Julius Caesar's day, Britain had been a province of the Roman Empire, and there had been a rebellion. And Constantine was with his father in York with the Roman legions, putting down those pesky Scots who refused to stay conquered. They eventually just built a wall and said, fine, you stay over there. So he's proclaimed emperor in York, England. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means and how that came about and how he gets there. These are the 3 main sources for the facts that I've assembled tonight, and I've got my copies up here. My Eusebius looks a little different, but the Peter Leithart is probably my favorite of all of them. The David Potter is good, but it's just a straight dragnet, just the facts, ma'am. And he's less interested in the theological or the ecclesiastical aspects of Constantine's life. Leithart is very interested in those topics. And Eusebius, of course, is a contemporary and an eyewitness. So Constantine's life raises some questions that people still have. He doesn't get much more than a paragraph in most history textbooks these days. As you know, the emperor who converted to Christianity. It's a mark that Christianity is now becoming more and more the norm and more influential in the Roman Empire. Although at the time of his conversion, it would be hard to make a case that it gave him any significant advantage. The number of Christians in the empire is very difficult to gauge, but most people say it's certainly less than 10 million and maybe less than 5 million. And at that point, probably no more than 100 million people total in all of the provinces of the Roman Empire. So you don't gain a lot of points by catering to a small minority of 5%. the question, not only did he really convert, there is controversy about that, and different historians take different positions. There's controversy about how much he controlled the church, whether he controlled the church at all, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. He was also a participant at the Council of Nicaea. In fact, he summoned the bishops to the Council of Nicaea. It was his urgent call to them that led to that meeting, and he attended, although he did not preside. And he does not seem to have actually played any role in the deliberations. The short version of that is he just kind of wanted them to make up their minds and get along. It's like, I don't have a solution, a theological solution to dictate to you, but I really would like you to stop fighting. So could we get all the bishops together and you guys come up with a solution that everybody agrees on and stop fighting? It's not good for the church. It's not good for the Roman Empire. The fourth question you can answer with a no. Did he mandate that every Roman citizen become a Christian? No. No, not only did not make Christianity the official religion of the empire, he simply issued an edict of toleration. He ended the last and the greatest persecution that had been carried out by the Roman emperors. And we'll talk about that. It's one reason why his conversion was such an earth-shattering event. So Rome, in the late 3rd century, 284, it has 3 big problems. It has a succession problem, which they've never really solved. They've never really successfully done hereditary succession from one emperor to another. They've tried, but there have been a series of coups d'etats. There have been a series of military uprisings. There have been a couple of civil wars already, and they haven't quite figured it out. They've got a border problem, especially in the Far East. There is a rival empire. It's very powerful and has actually, for the first time in the history of the Roman Republic through the empire, inflicted a couple of military defeats on Rome, something that was very upsetting to them. The Persian Empire, by the way, the Persians are still very proud of that they defeated the Roman Empire and refused to be conquered. One of the Roman emperors was taken prisoner when his legions were defeated and executed by the Persians. So there's a huge problem there. That one, for the Romans, sort of fortuitously solves itself because the Persians, as it turns out, have a succession problem of their own. And after a couple of strong Persian emperors, there are weak offspring and civil war, and so the Romans can stop worrying about military conflict on their eastern border. They also have a Christian problem. And the Christian problem is that the Christians are kind of like the Jews. They are viewed as an ornery, rebellious, cranky, distracting, disobedient minority within the empire who are disturbing the norms of political, cultural, and religious life. They won't participate in any of the ceremonies of the traditional Roman gods. And the Romans didn't care if you wanted to worship Jesus or Mithras or Minerva or Anubis, it's fine. But if you won't do at least a once-a-year offering to the genus of the Roman gods and the emperor, then you're not being patriotic, and you're disturbing the patriotic duty and unity of the Roman Commonwealth. So all 3 of these are coming up. We're going to see the problem gets dramatically worse in the last couple of decades of the 3rd century. So the Roman Republic, which is really the more interesting question in Roman history, is not why did the empire fall, but why did the Republic fail? And the Republic fails with Gaius Octavius, who's known to us as Caesar Augustus from Luke chapter 1. In those days, a decree went out that all the world should be taxed under the Emperor Caesar Augustus. So he's the first recognized emperor. His relative, uncle, adopted father is Gaius Julius Caesar. But you can go back a couple of generations before to these 2 previous names here, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius, whoops, I misspelled his name, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, 2 generals in the 2nd century BC who begin the erosion of the Republic. In the Republic, they hold an annual election. They pick 2 executive leaders. 2 consuls who share power. They have a Senate that controls finances and appointments. They have a very ordered system of government, and the Republic came into existence because they didn't want to have kings. The worst thing you could say in Roman politics in the days of the Republic was, my opponent is a Nazi, and he's Hitler. Not really, but the equivalent in Roman politics was to say, my opponent wants to be king. That's why Caesar was assassinated. There was a rumor that Caesar wanted to be king. And he's at great pains to try and dispel the rumor, but they assassinate him anyway. Well, Gaius Octavian, Caesar Augustus, doesn't take the title king. He takes the title commander, which is tyrant in all but, and in fact doesn't have any of the later restrictions that medieval kingship had. In fact, it's a mistake to think of the Roman Empire like a medieval kingdom. It's not. These 4 gentlemen here are all generals, and their path to power is always with the army. It is the army that overthrows the Republic, and you see that in the succeeding generations. There's Augustus, and then his successors, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, they're all generals. Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Lucius Verus, they're all generals. And usually it's a coup d'etat that brings them to power. Here's what the empire looked like. All of these possessions, all of these territories have governors appointed by the Senate initially. By the time period we're talking about, the commander, and the Roman word for commander is imperator, emperor, it means commander, is appointing the governors. There are the provinces of Italy, and then there are the provinces surrounding the Mediterranean. And this is all territory that was acquired by the city of Rome when it was a republic. But with that much territory to administer and to defend, there are legions after legion after legion. There's fortification and garrison and generals. Caesar makes his reputation by conquering Gaul. Marius and Sulla had conquered Greece and parts of Asia Minor. So the Roman generals acquire wealth and power. And eventually, the armies that they lead become their armies, not Rome's armies. I don't want you to even try and read this. This is the emperors of the 1st century, the 2nd century, the 3rd century, and the 4th century, and just kind of squint, don't even try and read, and you can tell what the problem is. And you see them on the timeline up here. You've got this is the year of 5 emperors. Political assassination, political assassination, political assassination, political assassination. There's a special Roman legion that's stationed in Rome. It's called the Praetorian Guard. It's 3,000 armed warriors. It's under the personal command of the emperor. And it's kind of like the Secret Service. And they realize fairly quickly that they're the only armed force in the middle of the Italian peninsula. And if the emperor doesn't pay them, they can just bump him off and put somebody else in his place. So this first crisis in the 1st century is the year of 5 emperors. In 1 year, they have 5 emperors. And it's coup d'etat after coup d'etat after coup d'etat. They're general after general after general. Well, you've got the same thing going on in the 3rd century as things start to devolve. I've joked with my students sometimes that really calling it the Roman Empire is misleading, because when we hear Roman Empire, we think Hollywood movies, and the emperors are always cast as British actors with nice upper-class accents, and they're not. It's not that clean Hollywood version. It really is more like the Roman Banana Republic. It's a military dictatorship. These guys are tyrants. And they're always backed by the army. So you've got this crisis again in the 3rd century, and the question is, how are we going to solve it? And along comes a strong emperor named Diocletian, and he thinks he has come up with a solution. He's going to divide the empire into two and share power. Which is interesting because it's an echo of the Roman Republic where they had two consuls, except these guys are not going to be elected. He's going to divide the empire into because there happen to be two people with large armies. He's like, well, instead of fighting a civil war, why don't we just say, you stay over there, I'll stay over here, you can rule in your part and I'll rule in my part, and then we'll just pretend it's all one country. And they do. So you see the district of Galerius as Caesar and Diocletian as Augustus. The district of Maximian, or Constantius as Caesar and Maximian as Augustus. So Maximian as Augustus controls Italy and North Africa and Spain. And his second in command, sort of his vice emperor, Constantius, controls Gaul and Britain. Constantius is Constantine's father. So Diocletian has the rather remarkable idea that he's going to rule for 20 years and then he's going to retire. And no emperor had, well, Sulla kind of sort of did at the end of his tyranny. He went to his estate and didn't want to be bothered anymore. But most of these guys, you know, they don't step down voluntarily. Their rule as emperor comes to an end because they are killed. Diocletian builds himself a palace over here in the Adriatic. Still exists. It's a big tourist spot. They filmed a lot of Game of Thrones in Diocletian's palace, his retirement home. And in theory, Diocletian will retire, Maximian will retire, and Constantius and Galerius will succeed as the senior Augustus, and they will each appoint a second in command. But the rule, as proposed by Diocletian, is none of these four should ever appoint a son. It should be more of a meritocracy. Well, that's Diocletian's solutions. And on paper, it looks pretty good, and it works. So in the west, Maximian, Constantius. In the east, Diocletian and Galerius. And then in 305, Diocletian has a big ceremony where he steps down, retires, passes on his portion of the empire to his second in command, Galerius. Galerius appoints Maximinus. Maximian, probably a little more reluctantly than Diocletian. He wasn't apparently as crazy about the idea, but he said, okay, well, all right, we're going to retire. He retires, and Constantius succeeds him and appoints Severus Caesar. Here's the problem. Constantius has a son, and Maximian has a son, and they don't like being passed over. So when Constantius dies in York, his troops say, yeah, we don't like Severus. We're not going to recognize Severus as the next senior Augustus in the West. We're going to proclaim Constantine because he's been fighting with us. We know him. He's an officer. He's been fighting in his father's army. He grew up at the court of Diocletian. And Maxentius does the same thing. He says, you know, I should have been an heir to my father's office. And so now you have 5 people claiming to be emperor and a 6th one in North Africa just for good measure. Because he's got command of the legions there. And he doesn't like any of the other 5 guys. So Diocletian's proposed reform, proposed solution to the succession problem does not even succeed once. The first time they try and do it, it falls apart. Constantine, proclaimed emperor in York, now he doesn't stay there. He crosses back into Gaul, he crosses to Shearer, and he is an excellent general. He's an excellent leader of troops. He's a good tactician. He understands logistics. In his 30-year career, 31 years he's emperor, he never loses a war. He only very rarely loses a battle. And so from 306 to 312, he's fighting and defeats all of his rivals in the West, becomes the sole emperor, doesn't appoint a second in command. And then from 312 to 324, he defeats his rival in the East, and all of a sudden now Diocletian's reforms are swept away. Constantine has restored the unity of the empire. He is the emperor over the whole shooting match. And rules for 30 years and dies of old age, not assassinated. Very, very interesting. Yeah, from 324 to 337. Well, he's proclaimed emperor first in 306, so they write up his reign as having lasted 31 years. He's not really sole emperor until 324. It takes 18 years for him to eliminate all of his rivals. There's the tetrarchy. You see Maximian, Constantius, Galerius, Diocletian. It still has a kind of political unity. It has a cultural unity, although there are different emphases. The West is Latin-speaking, and the East is Greek-speaking. But both of the emperors and in both parts of the empire, the people in the Greek-speaking portion of the empire learned to speak Latin, and the people in the Latin-speaking portion of the empire learned to speak Greek. So almost everyone is bilingual. Greece, by the way, has kind of faded into obscurity. In fact, the great Athenian democracy, the Greek cities, I've talked about this when I preached on Corinthians, Athens has faded. It's not even the Roman capital of the province. Corinth is the capital of the province. Athens has declined in population and prestige and, almost every other way. All right, we need to talk about Constantine converting to Christianity. 312, just before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. That might be in the paragraph in your history book. The day before or the night before the battle, probably the day before, because he sees some sort of an apparition in the sky, some kind of a halo around the sun or the image of a cross around the sun. And the Milvian Bridge, this battle occurs in the course of his civil war with the other rivals in the West. And the Milvian Bridge is actually right outside the city of Rome. Constantine has come down from the provinces that are his home base, his home territory in Gaul, brought his legions down south into Italy. They've marched through northern Italy, defeated all of the Roman legions who opposed them, and he's got his last opponent, Maxentius, in Rome. Maxentius comes out of the city to give battle. Constantine outmaneuvers him, defeats his cavalry, and then crushes his foot soldiers. He's killed, drowned while trying to retreat back to Rome. And Constantine, as a result of this victory, is now sole emperor in the West. This is where he secures victory in the Civil War against his rivals in the West. This is the Battle of Milvian Bridge. And it's also the moment that's identified as his conversion to Christianity. In fact, he gives credit for this victory to his conversion to Christianity. Eusebius has an account. See if I can find it here. And Eusebius said this account was told to him by Constantine himself. There we go, Life of Constantine, if I can find it. Okay. While he was praying, he called on God with earnest prayer and supplications that he would reveal to him who he was. There's some indication that Constantine's father may have been a Christian. We don't know for sure. Constantius. Pretty sure his mother was already a Christian at this point, so Constantine had been exposed to Christianity. He's praying to God that he would reveal to him who he was and stretch forth his right hand to help him in his present difficulties. This is Eusebius' account. While he was thus praying with fervent entreaty, a most marvelous sign appeared to him from heaven. the account of which it might have been hard to believe had it been related by any other person. But since the victorious emperor himself long afterwards declared it to the writer of this history, when he was honored with his acquaintance in society and confirmed his statement by an oath, who could hesitate to accredit the relation, especially since the testimony of aftertimes has established its truth? He said, this is Eusebius saying, this is what Constantine told me happened that day. He said that about noon, when the day was already beginning to decline, he saw with his own eyes the trophy of a cross of light in the heavens above the sun, bearing the inscription, "Conquer by this," in hoc signe vinco, or vince. At this sight, he himself was struck with amazement, and his whole army also, which followed him on this expedition, and also witnessed this miracle. He said, moreover, that he doubted within himself what the import of this apparition could be. And while he continued to ponder and reason on its meaning, night suddenly came on. Then in his sleep, so he's seen the cross, he's been praying to God. It's not clear that he associates any of this at first with the God of the Christians. He says, in his sleep, the Christ of God appeared to him with the same sign, which he had seen in the heavens, commanded him to make a likeness of that sign, which he had seen, and to use it as a safeguard in all engagements with his enemies. At the dawn, he arose, communicated the marvel to his friends, calling together the workers in gold and precious stones. He sat in the midst of them and described to them the figure of the sign he had seen, bidding them represent it in gold and precious stones. And then this is Eusebius. And this representation I myself have had an opportunity of seeing. So that's the account, the day before the battle. And this is 306, the territory he controls. 312, he adds the territory in pink. 316, he has the territory in kind of, great, here we go. This is the Balkan area. And then 324, everything over in the east. So that by 324, he's sole emperor. All right, I want to talk a little more about Eusebius. I promised I'd give you a quick bio on him. He is born in the Roman province of Palestine, probably born in Caesarea Maritima, educated at Antioch and Caesarea Maritima. He's a student of Bishop Pamphilius of Caesarea in 280. And Caesarea is, by 280, a much more important city. It's the Roman capital of that province. Jerusalem was destroyed. Successive rebellions, 70 and 120 AD, Jerusalem was laid waste and abandoned by 120 AD. It was a ruined city, no longer suitable for the Roman government. So the capital of the province is in Caesarea. This is where Eusebius is born, where he becomes a student of the bishop. After completing an education, he became a teacher, taught other students in Caesarea. Pamphilius had a school. In the 290s, he began writing a history of the church. And that's the first history of the church that we have. He picks it up from the book of Acts, and he brings it down to the 290s. Bishop Pamphilius was arrested in 307 and martyred in 309. So Eusebius is at this point in his 40s. He's grown up. He's been educated. He has been ordained a priest and an elder. He's been a teacher at the school. Christianity is still a small minority religion. And his teacher, his patron, his mentor, his faculty advisor, his headmaster of the school where he teaches is martyred. We'll talk about why that happens in a minute, but you have to get that picture of who Eusebius is. And 4 years later, Eusebius is elected the bishop of Caesarea. And by 313, Constantine has become a Christian and ended the persecution and issued an edict of toleration. Now you see how the lives intersect and overlap. 325, Eusebius, as the bishop of Caesarea, attends the Council of Nicaea, and he gives us an account of the deliberations. 337, the year Constantine died, he writes a biography of Constantine, which is viewed very critically now because he leaves out all the bad stuff. And there are other biographers, there are other contemporary accounts. Constantine you have to remember, he's a general, and he is almost always on military campaign, and he is, from time to time, not as often as in the 3rd century, but from time to time, he faces rebellions, which he has to put down. And occasionally, he faces a rebellion from in his own household, from in his own family. So one of his sons betrayed him with his second wife, his stepmother, and that kind of upset him. He had both of them killed, both of them executed. His father-in-law, 2 of his father-in-law, both led rebellions against him, and he defeated them. After multiple defeats, he had them executed. Eusebius leaves that out, but in fairness to Eusebius, he says in his biography that he is setting himself the task of describing Constantine's religious life and his religious convictions. And so the political is not really that important for him. He wants to talk about Constantine's manner of life and his behavior, especially after his conversion. Eusebius dies in 339. He outlives Constantine by 2 years. Here's why the Edict of Toleration is so important, why it matters so much. There had been local persecutions. This was not the first time Christians had been undergoing a wave of persecution, but almost all of the previous persecutions had been local and very short-lived, usually one provincial governor. So if you read Fox's Book of Martyrs and you get the accounts of martyrs from these earlier persecutions, they happened. We have external sources that document and confirm them, but they were not empire-wide. In fact, Governor Pliny wrote Trajan a letter, which we have, saying, hey, I've got a whole bunch of I got a long list of complaints about these crazy people who are following this Jewish rabbi. And everybody's accusing them of being impious and atheists and denying the gods and generally troublemakers. What should I do with them? And Trajan's answer is, ignore them. We get 2 emperors in the 3rd century who do launch empire-wide persecutions. For 2 years under Decius, for 3 years under Valerian. Valerian is the one who went to campaign against the Persian Empire and was defeated, captured, and executed by the Persians. And the Christians went, yeah, this is what happens when you attack God's church. Don't be like Valerian. Some of the bishops did actually write that. But the last persecution was the worst. Diocletian, who's trying to reorder the empire, issues an edict in 303, February. Christian temples are to be torn down, and they call them temples because any place where a god is worshipped to the Roman mind is a temple. We would call it a church. In the Romans, it was a temple to a different god. Christian temples are to be torn down, Christian scriptures are to be burned, Christian property is to be seized. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why we don't have very many manuscripts that date prior to 300 AD. We have fragments. We don't have any complete Bibles from before 300 AD because this was an empire-wide persecution. They went to the church and they said, we have a decree, hand over your books. And sometimes people played dumb, say, well, they're not here. Or sometimes they played really dumb and they gave them Greek mythological stories and say, here they are, you can burn these. In some places, the Roman officials actually played along. I got a decree here that says I'm supposed to burn your scriptures. You got any scriptures I could burn? And they hand him some books, and he said, okay, thank you very much. I'll check it out. I'll send a report in that I confiscated your scriptures, and I burned them. So, I mean, because it's a huge territory. So local practices are all over the place. Some local administrators, some proconsuls and governors are very strict. Others not so much. Constantius refused to enforce these edicts in the territory that he governed. Those edicts are renewed, and then later in 304, there's a new requirement for all Roman citizens to offer public sacrifice to the Roman gods in the genus of the emperor and do it publicly and get a certificate. And if you didn't, you could be arrested. If you didn't, and you were employed by the Roman government in any capacity, you lost your job. If you didn't, and you were a soldier in any of the legions, you were dishonorably discharged. Those who will not sacrifice to be imprisoned until they do. And some, of course, who spoke up and were just downright annoying, got themselves martyred because they said, away with the atheists. Constantine's father would not enforce those decrees. But this lasted for 10 years. This was devastating for the church. As I said, this is the persecution that caused the death of Eusebius's patron, teacher, bishop. It's this decree and this persecution that causes his martyrdom. So the Edict of Milan, 313, it legalized Christianity. In Roman law, it gave toleration. It did not give dominance. It just said it's legal to be a Christian. Stop bothering the Christians. Everybody who wants to be a pagan, you want to go worship this God, that God, whatever, it doesn't matter. Stop bothering the Christians. Let them worship the God they want to. And don't bother them because they won't worship the Roman gods. Of more interest, and it's Constantine's action. Constantine puts into this edict, as the new emperor, sole ruler in the West, Christian property is to be restored. They had confiscated, when they tore down the Christian temples, they confiscated the property. He says Christian property is to be restored, and anything that was taken out of their temple, you are to restore or provide them with compensation. Return their scriptures. If you didn't burn them, give them back. And Constantine actually, a little later on, will actually commission copies of the scriptures to be made at the Roman government's expense. And Christian churches are to be rebuilt. And some of them are rebuilt by grants from the Roman government. Some of them are rebuilt from the personal funds of Constantine himself. And here's what Eusebius says the immediate response among the Christian community was in 313. We especially, who placed our hopes in the Christ of God, had unspeakable gladness, and a certain inspired joy bloomed for all of us when we saw every place reviving and temples again rising. That's Bishop Eusebius, because he became a bishop that year. Okay, so we've got to come back to this question of whether Constantine was a Christian or not. Because some people will argue that it was simply an expedient. He had a vision, but what did he know? He was a general. He was a military guy. Did anybody ever teach him the scriptures? Did he know the gospel? And the answer is yes. He actually had grown up as a prince. He had been at the court of Diocletian. He'd not only learned the arts of warfare and military, but he had been educated at the court and educated in rhetoric and educated in the classics of Greek and Roman literature and mythology. Eusebius says that after his conversion, he became a student of the scriptures. He actually spent time every day studying the scriptures and asking questions. He funded the construction of churches. He rebuilt the churches in Rome. He founds a new capital city for the whole empire in Constantinople. Yes, rather modestly named after himself. But there are 50 churches built there at public expense. And he sends his mother. His mother wants to go to Palestine and find the locations of the events from the life of Jesus from the New Testament. And he has churches built. He has a church built in Bethlehem at the place of Jesus' birth. He has a church built in Jerusalem at the place of Jesus' burial and resurrection. And it's because his mother is over there heading up all of this. She's quite an interesting. She's St. Helena. He commissioned copies of the scriptures to be made for the churches. We don't know for sure whether this is one of them. This is a facsimile. This is a reprint. It's full size of a page from what's called the Codex Sinaiticus, found by Tischendorf at the monastery in the Sinai. It dates to about 350, maybe a little earlier. It might be 320s. We have letters. Eusebius records in his biography the letter that Constantine sent him from Constantinople, directing him, get your scribes, your best scribes together. I will pay for all the materials. It'll be at the expense of the Roman government. I want 50 copies of the complete scriptures for the churches in Constantinople. And if this is not one of those pages, it probably looks very, very much like them. Parchment, large, this is like pulpit Bible size. And one of the interesting details on this, so we were talking about this with Carrie earlier, is a fixed number of letters per line. They're all capitals. There are no spaces. There's no punctuation marks. It's the same number of letters on each line. It's like a checksum. For those of you that do computer work, you get the same number of letters each line so that you get the fidelity of each copy can be quickly verified. Of course, it's a bear now to try and read. But you know it's accurate. There's no chapter divisions. There's a heading, a name of each book, no chapter divisions. We don't get those till 1200. And if there's no chapter divisions, there's no verse numbers. So this is actually John 2 to John 3. It's got John 3:16 on here, and I challenge you to go find it. John 3:16 is in here somewhere. It's over here in one of these two columns. I actually was working with it a couple of weeks ago. I found Nicodemus twice because I could make that out. But it wraps. It's not even all on one line together. Anyway, if you want more, I did a whole lecture on the history of the church in 8 Bibles. But that's Constantine is responsible for that. He begged the bishops to seek unity and stop fighting. He didn't tell them theologically, he didn't dictate the Nicene Creed. He actually had no part in the creed. But he wanted them to just agree and stop fighting. He was tired. He said it's actually destructive of the peace of the whole empire that Christian bishops in different parts of the empire are fighting with each other, and they were fighting with each other. Athanasius and Arius, at the Council of Nicaea, St. Nicholas actually punches somebody in the face. That's one of my favorite memes. I'm St. Nicholas, I'm bringing toys for all the good girls and boys, and I'm going to punch heretics, and I'm all out of toys. So, yeah, that really happened. They arrested him, by the way. Held him overnight, and let him go back and resume debate. He voted with the right side. So he did have influence on the bishops, but he never usurped their authority. He never tried to direct what the bishops were supposed to be doing. He never sought to appoint a bishop. Bishops were elected by the local church in every province. In the provincial capitals, they were the archbishops supervising the bishops in the other cities, but they were elected. He never attempted to intervene, to put anybody in any position of authority in any of the church. He never dictated theology. He called the bishops to meet in council, and he paid their expenses. Like, we got to have a meeting. Send me the receipts, I'll pick up the tab. He ended the gladiatorial shows. Now, he had attended them when he was a prince. He had attended them before he became a Christian. As emperor, he issued a decree saying it's not fitting, it's not appropriate. We should not be using the death of gladiators or even wild beasts as entertainment. So he ended them by imperial decree, and he condemned the exposure of infants. His edicts made it a crime. It had been a common practice in the Roman Empire. So he's pro-life. Important things to remember about him. It's a mistake to think of him as a saint, as someone who lives a monkish, virtuous life, although he does seem to have been someone of integrity and not given to excessive. He's not a womanizer. He doesn't have mistresses. He has successively, I think, 3 marriages, but in each case he was a widower and then remarried. But he is always a general. He became emperor, but he remained a general. He got to be emperor because he was a successful general, and he remained a general as he was an emperor. He's not like a medieval king. He really is a military commander, and he stays in power because he understands the army. He learned the military arts as a nobleman under Diocletian. He fought with and for his father, Constantius, on his campaigns. He defeated all his rivals in the east and all his rivals in the west, and he conducted military campaigns for all 31 years of his reign. But since 312, he was a Christian. He remained a Christian until his death. He encouraged and supported the church. He encouraged the bishops. He commissioned the copying of Bibles. He paid for the construction of new church buildings. When he sensed he was dying in 335, he resolved to go to Israel because he wanted to be baptized in the Jordan. Eusebius records this in his biography. He said as he realized that he was coming to the end of his life, he had not been baptized. That was not all that unusual at the time. But he said, I want to go to Israel and be baptized in the Jordan. He made it about 60 miles and couldn't go any further. He was in Nicomedia, which is Izmit in Turkey now, just on the eastern side there. He asked for the bishop of Nicomedia to come and baptize him. And we have an account of his baptism and his words. I don't think Eusebius is making it up. I don't think Constantine led a blameless, perfect life. He was a politician. He was a government leader. He was a general. He was, tyrant is probably not quite the right word, but he was the head of a military junta. He had supreme power, and he wanted to keep peace for all of his subjects and defend Rome against her enemies external and put down any civil wars that might arise internally. And he did. But he contributes to what we call the Middle Ages. The Constantine's restoration of the empire doesn't last all that long. Okay, so his death in 333, less than 100 years later, the barbarians sacked the city of Rome. It's really only a very short time after his death. Things fall apart again in the 4th century. And by the 5th century, in the West, that part which Diocletian had marked off, the last Roman emperor dies and nobody even bothers to claim the title because there's a Roman king, not a Roman king, a German tribal leader who's the king of Italy, Theodoric the Ostrogoth. And he doesn't care a fig about the title of emperor. He's quite content to be the king of Italy. And there's a guy who was Roman emperor for a while. When he died, nobody wanted the job. So the Roman Empire doesn't go out with a bang. You can't say, here's the point at which they were defeated and the Roman Empire ended. It's like, well, this guy died, and a year later, nobody had been named emperor after him, and 5 years later, there still wasn't anybody, and then it got to be 20 years, and everybody goes, I guess we're not going to have an emperor. So the ingredients of the Middle Ages are Romanitas. There's a lot of inheritance from Rome. The old Roman provinces become kingdoms. The Germanic tribes take them over. The Visigoths take Spain. The Franks take Gaul. The Ostrogoths and then the Lombards take Italy. Different Germanic tribes take the old Roman provinces, but the Roman provincial identity and a lot of the organization of Rome persists even in these new Germanic kingdoms. So Romanitas, Germanitas, and Christianitas because of Constantine. So, hey, I got done. We got 8 minutes left, and I will be happy to take questions and try and respond. You just have to, with the caveat that I may have to tell you I don't know. Because there's a lot that we don't know about this period. There's a lot, even having read these books, I'm going, these historians say, yeah, we don't really know what happened here. There's no account, no record. So, did I get your question?
I'm rereading. I have a third-party question to be asked only if it wasn't answered in the lecture. And so I'm rereading it to see. I think you kind of answered it early on, but the question was, Constantine was coming into his rule. It's the weakening
Yeah, Constantine never made Christianity the official religion, but he was personally a supporter and personally a benefactor and personally sort of took the church under his wing, but the majority of the citizens of the empire were still pagan, the overwhelming majority. But Constantine said, hey, I want to help build the churches. I want to try to get the bishops to stop fighting. I'm going to send my mom to Jerusalem. I've got a wonderful spot here. After Constantine's conversion, the bishop of Jerusalem sent him a letter. Eusebius records this as well. Because here's at the time of Jesus, Golgotha, the garden tomb, and there was a slope of a hill. In 120 AD, the Romans came in and rebuilt it and renamed it. So Hadrian built a temple. There was a statue of Jupiter and a statue of Venus. These sites had already become destinations of Christian pilgrims coming to visit them. Hadrian brought in a huge landfill, raised the site into a big platform, built a temple to Jupiter and put a statue of Venus out front, and Golgotha and the garden tomb were buried. The bishop of Jerusalem writes Constantine after he issues the Edict of Toleration and said, I would like to request permission to excavate, to tear down this temple and excavate. And so at the time of Constantine, and Constantine's mother comes and supervises, they excavate what had been the old temple. They reopen and gain access to the tomb and Golgotha and build a church. And that church is the lowest layer of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's not the church that she had built is not the church that's still standing now, but it's on that site. We can actually trace, this book does a good job of showing some of the other levels and layers there. In my lifetime, archaeology has shifted from being very skeptical as to whether the Church of the Holy Sepulchre really marked any place where anything really happened, and come full circle and said, kind of looks like this is where it happened. And it's largely because they've gone back and read Eusebius again. And Eusebius records the request from the Bishop of Jerusalem, who says to Constantine, I would like permission to tear down this temple and re-excavate. We know that these sites were there. We know they are underneath the rubble that was brought in. Can I tear down that temple and uncover the place of Jesus' crucifixion and the tomb where he was buried and where the resurrection happened? And Constantine says, not only that, I'll pay for it. Have at it. And I'll send my mother to supervise. Yeah.
Rob, I've been there, and I went down in there, where that tomb is. But then there's also, if anyone's been to Israel, there's the garden tomb, right?
Yeah, Gordon's Calvary. Gordon's Calvary is actually over out beside the Damascus Gate, and it's got a cliff, a bluff that looks like it could be Golgotha. Probably not. Although the tomb that is in that garden is typical of first century tombs. It's very much like what those tombs are like, but that's probably not the one Jesus was buried in. It probably is the one that's underneath.
Okay, that's just what I was kind of wondering.
Yeah.
It's difficult to know. I mean, everyone says something else.
Yeah.
I went to both places and prayed.
30 years ago, when I was in Israel, they were saying, oh, don't even bother, the Church of Holy Sepulchre. Yeah, nobody knows whether it's in the right spot or not. That has changed in the last 20 years. The archaeological evidence, I mean, the archaeologists have changed their opinion. Part of it is they've done restoration. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they actually have uncovered the oldest parts of it. They had to fix some parts of it were falling down. They had to do some repairs. And lo and behold, they were able to date things that go back to St. Helena, Constantine's mother. So, and Constantine is very interested in that. Like I say, Christians are still a minority. But he's supportive. He provides funds. Yeah.
How much did Christianity grow and flourish under his patronage? Was there a large spread?
Oh, yes. And Eusebius celebrates it. He says, now for the first time we can openly meet. We can openly build churches. We can openly preach the gospel. And so there is an explosion. There's a great deal of missionary activity. about the same time, you have the first Christian kingdom in Armenia, which is sort of wedged in between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. And the king of Armenia converts as well. Actually converts a little bit before Constantine, so they proudly proclaim themselves as the oldest Christian nation. But yeah, and then the really interesting thing is, as the Germanic tribes start crashing into the Roman provinces and crossing the Danube and the Rhine into Roman territory, they're pretty quickly evangelized and converted. Even when they defeat the Roman population, they're converted. One of the interesting details about St. Patrick is he's not Irish, he's Roman. His father was an official in the Roman government in the 5th century, in the 400s, in the island of Britain. And Patrick had heard the gospel and apparently been baptized and sort of nominally a Christian as a teenager before he got kidnapped by pirates, literally, and carried off into slavery in Ireland where he tended sheep, and he heard a voice saying, okay, it's time for you to go down to the coast. There's a ship waiting for you. So he runs away from his slave owner, and at the coast, there's a ship. And they agree to take him on board. Now, they don't take him straight back to England. They take him to Gaul, and he has to kind of work his way back. And then he has a vision and a dream. Some of the Irish, he learned to speak Gaelic, which is unknown in the Roman world. He learned to speak Gaelic, and there's a youth who says, come back and preach to us. And so he goes to the bishop in Gaul that he's been serving and says, would you ordain me a bishop? I want to go back to Ireland. So he goes back to the people who had held him as a slave and preaches the gospel. But he's not Irish. He's Roman. Yeah.
What modern government would you say is most like the Roman Empire during Jesus'?
The empire or the republic? Because they're two radically different. The republic, the founding fathers of the United States very consciously knew the history of the republic, and that's why we have a Senate. It's why we have, an elected executive. They were quite consciously trying to revive the Roman Republic. Now, they didn't like the empire, but they knew why the republic had failed. It had failed because the generals took it over. And so actually the original Constitution of the United States contained a provision that forbade standing armies. Only in time of war was there supposed to be an army. In peacetime, there's not supposed to be a standing army because they knew what had happened to Rome. They knew what had happened to the Republic. It was overthrown by the generals.
Isn't that why we still have rules about deploying the armed forces?
Yeah.
Inside the nation.
Yeah, there's a
National Guard to do things that the army.
Posse comitatus, the military by law, by constitutional principle, is forbidden to actually even do any police for it. It's kind of an extraordinary bending of the rules to get the National Guard out in time of disaster. But they're not supposed to do any policing or any forceful actions. And that's because our founders knew the history of the Roman Republic. So yeah, they were trying to revive the Roman Republic. The empire is, you'll pardon the expression, and I'll accept Costa Rica as not falling into this category, but the Roman Empire is a Central American banana republic. It's ruled by a series of generals who keep assassinating each other. And it's chaos.
And during 30 AD, it would have been...
30 AD is the first emperor. Second emperor. Caesar Augustus dies in 14 AD. So Caesar Augustus is the emperor when Jesus is born. I've forgotten who the second emperor is, but there's a second emperor ruling by the time that Jesus is crucified. Gary?
Why would Constantine wait to the absolute last minute to be baptized?
It's an interesting question. There's several theories. We don't actually know exactly why, but there seems to have been among certain Christians the idea that baptism washed all of the guilt of all of your sins away, but that any sins you committed after baptism, you still somehow had to atone for and take care of. So you wanted to wait until you were close to death, because then you would have the clean slate. So if baptism wipes your slate clean, then there's a logical argument that a lot of early Christians actually practiced that same way. They became catechumen, they attended church, they joined the fellowship. It was like the position of the Jewish diaspora, where you had Gentiles who were attracted to the Jewish law and Jewish teaching, and they became God-fearing Gentiles without ever actually becoming Jewish. But they would attend the synagogue, they would listen to the rabbis, but they wouldn't actually go all the way to a complete conversion. Some of that, I think, is still going on at the time of Constantine. There are other explanations. Some people will highlight that and say, well, that just shows he was only nominally a believer. Not really. He might have had an incomplete or a very superstitious view of baptism. He was not a theologian. That was not his bent. But he did study the scriptures. And he did actually send for Christian leaders to come and teach him, even when he was emperor. He said he wanted to be taught. Eusebius records that as well. Yes?
I have a question about the nature of Eusebius's relationship with him. I think most of what you've said is that he's an eyewitness. Obviously, they would have brushed paths at the council and whatnot. How close or distant was their personal relationship?
He probably only saw Constantine half a dozen or a dozen times in his life. It's not like he was living in Constantinople. He was bishop in Caesarea. Saw him at the council. He actually reports that he thinks he saw him when he was a young man as an officer in Diocletian's army. Diocletian's army came through Caesarea. And Eusebius says, I think I saw Constantine. I remember seeing this soldier, this officer. But yeah, they were not, like buddy-buddy or going to, dinner at each other's house every week. They had met, they corresponded. We have a number of letters back and forth. Eusebius was a bishop and therefore held significant influence, and Constantine called on him for assistance in calling the councils and managing things. He actually sat next to Constantine at the Council of Nicaea. So there was at least some respect and acquaintanceship. Yeah.
Which Caesarea was he in?
Caesarea Maritima, not Philippi, not on the Sea of Galilee, but on the coast, on the Mediterranean.
Okay, I've been there as well. I didn't
Yeah.
know where he was.
It's spectacular ruins. There's a Roman aqueduct that still runs along the beach that's and traces of the original harbor.
One other question. Where did we get the electoral college from? That is also Roman?
Oh, that's a complicated. Rome had those sort of ad hoc colleges of advisors, senior officials. The Senate is sort of like that. Senate's not elected. The Senate is all the senior heads of all the families in Rome. And so it's like an electoral college itself. But the consuls, the executives who share power, are elected by a vote of all the Roman citizens. Direct vote. And so and Roman citizenship is then, over the course of the empire years, they expand Roman citizenship beyond just the citizens of the city of Rome. The other cities in Italy get citizenship, which means your name is written into a book in Rome. Paul uses that imagery with Philippi, because Philippi had been, the citizens of Philippi in Greece had been granted Roman citizenship by the emperor at that point. And Paul reminds them, your citizenship is not in Rome. Your citizenship is in heaven. Your name is written down. It doesn't matter that it's written in Rome. It's written somewhere else. Now, Paul uses that imagery that if you're a Roman citizen, that meant your name, it didn't mean you got a passport from the government of Italy. It meant your name was written down on the roll in the city of Rome. All right, well, thank you all for coming. I hope this is helpful. I hope this gives you a picture of what this particular phase of the history of the church was like. The persecution, the jubilation when the persecution came to an end, the reason why the Edict of Toleration was so significant for the church, and the impact that both the persecution and the toleration, the freedom, the ending of the persecution had in the life of the church. Next month, we'll go down 100 years and we'll talk about Augustine, who is the most influential theologian in the history of the church.